This is a challenging topic. It's about the challenges that we face. The topic, however, has two dimensions to it. It has a dimension which is about the usage of artificial intelligence, which drives substantial hyperscale change in organizations. And then the flip side, which is that it equally also imposes a degree of risk, maybe even some would say high levels of risk in all organizations. And as such, it becomes very important for everybody to deal with both aspects. Today, we will deal with the aspect of risk. In particular, therefore, relate the rules that have been proposed by the European Union and explore some of the first and second level order issues that might arise from a business perspective as we go forward. Now, we have to sort of start to set the stage for this. And obviously, therefore, our first point would be to look at how and what is actually proposed. This really proposes three levels of risk. This risk level is divided into, at first, unacceptable risk, which are systems that today would not be advised by the European Union or by governments that adopt the regulation. It's a high-level risk set of categories, which we will explore more. And then, of course, there are the minimal levels of risk. Now, obviously, these are depicted almost as being equal. It is very likely that most organizations in society will see this more as a pyramid, with the majority of the systems implemented being limited and minimal risk environments. However, it is important for everybody to understand how this risk can change your organization. And the reason is, you may even ask, why should I bother? I work in the IT organization, and I'm not really bothered with this from a perspective of deploying the technology. This is, in fact, one of the first emerging technologies that seem to have an impact across the organization. And therefore, as we start to deploy this has immediately become a business issue, more so than many other technologies that we may have deployed in the past, or even other emerging technologies that we're contemplating to deploy. So we need to understand these levels. Now, it's clear that the boundaries between the three are not well defined. It's also clear that over time, certain AI environments will move from one to the other as we gain sophistication in the deployments. Now, of the three, the high risk category is in the document probably the best defined. I trust all of you have read the 200-page document. This is, in fact, one of the most invigorating documents that you could ever imagine. After all, it was written by a combination of technology specialists, legal scholars, and politicians. The greatest combination in order for a new document to be put in place. However, as you scan over these 10 requirements, I think it will become immediately clear that there is not one single individual in your organization that actually has the responsibility for all of these. As you look at risk management system and the requirements, therefore, to document, maintain, and also ensure continuous environments to be managed, that clearly is something that lies both with the chief legal officer of an organization, as well as also with the board as part of managing this in terms of the board's responsibility around risk. Or if you look at the aspect of human oversight, the systems have to include a degree of human oversight through software interfaces. That clearly is a responsibility that is deployed within the HR organization. Hence, therefore, the HR executive should be involved in this, as well as, of course, with all of these, it is either the CIO or the chief product officer that will retain responsibility for ensuring that all of these are adhered to. The bottom line is, this is actually a technology area an emerging technology area that in many ways immediately becomes an enterprise level responsibility. And that is why it is so important to understand first, second, and even third level and degree responsibilities, challenges, and issues that arise from this. So the question is, who should be involved in this aspect of AI governance? Well, we've picked a number of them. Clearly above these different executives, you will find the board, and we will talk later about the responsibilities of the board. And below it, or maybe even around it, you will find the technology function and the CIO as being responsible for all aspects of ensuring that this works to the standards of the organization. But each business function and the executive responsible for that business function has unique responsibilities for the deployment, adherence, and maintenance of this future charter. The CFO has responsibility for the cost of artificial intelligence, but also financial risk. And since this poses a level of financial risk, that individual, he or she, becomes critical in the deployment. The chief data officer, if organizations have that, is obviously responsible for this under the context of coordinating the data governance and also AI governance charter for the organization. The CEO, she or he, obviously has to be the person of oversight, accountable in private organizations to the board and in public organizations to politicians in terms of setting the overall organizational accountability, but of course also looking at this positively, how in fact this can drive innovation and therefore revenue growth for the organization. The CMO is responsible for articulation of how this impacts customers, citizens, and therefore should be one of the key people, and we will talk about this later, involved in the articulation of a customer or brand charter for the organization. What is it that you will be stand? What is your position? What is your brand stand for when it comes to artificial intelligence? The chief legal officer, as we touched on earlier, is very involved in this, as is the chief human resource officer. The point being, all executives are immediately involved in an emerging technology, which is why the proposal from the European Union immediately becomes important for everyone. Now, again, you may say, I am neither of these positions, so why am I involved in this? First, you need to know that this is a technology that has enormous interest, but also awareness in the executive team. And secondly, you will not have seen similar situations in the past. This is clearly a new area, perhaps akin to what is happening with security in many organizations, in that it is important for you to be aware of and likely involved in a broader collection of individuals in the organization who are interested in the deployment of this technology. Right, with that, we can now start to speculate, perhaps even formulate specifically areas that will be impacted or that your organization should clearly start to consider now. And those are the 5 areas that I would want to see business leaders focus on as we move forward. The first is, and I alluded to this earlier, is the involvement of the board. The board is responsible for risk. The board is equally responsible for the strategy of organization. So as we started with outlining the fact that artificial intelligence both drives innovation and therefore growth, but also poses level of risk that needs to be better management, this sits purely and squarely with the board. So it becomes important that this year, boards have a conversation about how they will deal with this in the future. Now, many may say, well, wait a minute, this is only a proposal. It has not yet been finalized, nor has it been built into national legislation. And you're right. This may, in fact, take as long as it took GDPR to be implemented across Europe. However, since this is something that immediately becomes deployed around different technologies in your organization, the sooner you start, the easier the management of this becomes when in fact this becomes a legal requirement. Just think about it. You still don't know how many applications run in your organization. So how can you therefore know whether some of those applications, in fact, by stealth, have artificial intelligence or machine learning models built into them? This is why the board needs to be involved now and set the requirements across the organization for what should happen. The next thing is the accountability of business leaders. It is very clear that artificial intelligence is different in many ways than other technologies. And you may then ask, why is that? Well, we are clearly rapidly evolving into a situation in which we can frankly start to talk about the engagement or employment of digital employees. A couple of nights ago, I participated in a very interesting call in which an AI vendor demonstrated the capability of actually creating a digital investment banker. This was done within a low-code or no-code environment, allowing you basically to put together an environment that may not necessarily emulate everything that an investment banker does from a work perspective, but surely were supportive of certain tasks and functions that investment bankers did. Now, therefore, every person in an investment bank that starts to manage people or be accountable for a certain amount of business, therefore increasingly has AI part of their responsibility. Add to that then the EU Charter and the definitions of different risk levels, it will become important for every leader in investment banks, and now let's broaden it out because all of you will have digital employees. And as a result, therefore, every leader needs to become aware of and in fact manage environments that contain artificial intelligence and machine language codes. As a result, therefore, they need to be aware of the ramifications of the legislation and the risk levels that pertain to the Artificial Intelligence Act that has just been proposed. So business leaders really have to start to build awareness, build personal critical capabilities and competencies in the artificial intelligence. In fact, artificial intelligence, data, and data science really become a broad business leadership skill set or competency. Leaders will be hired on the basis of whether or not they know how to manage in such environments. So the second point here, business leader accountability, is really critical for what will happen going forward. Our third point is the point around continuous monitoring. Now, as I said early on, you likely don't know the exact number of applications that run across your organization. Certainly, if your organization is a larger organization, it's highly likely that this week a new piece of software was brought in a department somewhere in your organization. And ultimately, with that follows a requirement, therefore, to understand whether or not those products contain machine learning environments or environments, in fact, that now start to be part of and need to be defined in the context of the 3 risk levels that we saw earlier on. So that means that we need to think about how do we deploy a centralized repository that in some way doesn't only keep an asset inventory of what was bought, but also contains a continuous way of monitoring these environments so that we know whether or not they changed. If you go back to our 3 levels, and perhaps more better depicted as a pyramid, those different environments that you have may likely move up and potentially down into those risk levels. And therefore, you need to know at any given time where your organization stands on this. So continuous monitoring and the ability to operationally monitor at a central level what happens, behavior of the models, and the impact of the models become critical for every organization. This is a responsibility that lies with the executive team. You will need to ensure that accountability is assigned somewhere in the organization, at minimal, at a coordinating level, and in some instances, possibly at an accountability or responsibility level. So continuous monitoring is critical. And I just go back to my question. You don't know how many applications you have, so you likely don't know how many AI models you have running in your organization. This has in fact given rise to what one could call shadow AI. Many of you will in the past remember what we termed as being the end user shadow application environments. AI is in some way mimicking this or replicating those kind of situations where we don't know who will bring in these environments because they come embedded within systems and aren't necessarily clearly indicated as systems that may pose risk. Obviously here, as we go back to what the proposal from the European Union is, there will eventually be a national and European level repository that will in fact contain information about the level of risk within all products and therefore services that are supported by products as we go forward. And this will likely become an inventory that gets used by organizations in terms of approving products that come into their organizations. But again, the challenge becomes when you have shadow deployment of technology, the actual end user may not in fact know whether or not a product poses risk. We will get back to that in our 5th point. Our 4th point is that how do you now then determine when technology enters the organization, and especially when technology at a certain risk level enters the organization? And while some people here may regard it as a choke point, it's very clear that as we look at deployment of the regulation, the role of purchasing, the organization purchasing, becomes critical in this. The role of purchasing right now is actually a point of record and often also a point of continuous monitoring of products and services across the organization. It becomes important that we educate and empower the purchasing organization so that they, in fact, can become part of the deployment of a continuous evolving asset registry of the machine learning models that are deployed in the organization. It will not be wise to have the deployment and continuous monitoring of these environments reside separate to the organization that in many ways is part of monitoring the entry and perhaps also the usage of technology. So the combination of working with purchasing and the IT organization becomes a critical part of ensuring that the organization can adhere to these standards as we move forward and can embed the legislation effectively inside the actions of the organization. And then last, and perhaps even more broad than just about the EU Charter, which of course is only a narrow sliver of what in many ways is the impact of artificial intelligence across organization, we have communication. Communication has always been critical, has in fact over the course of the last 18 months shown itself as being really vital to informing people about what goes on in the organization. Now, with the deployment, the increased proliferation of artificial intelligence across your organization, we are rapidly getting to a stage in which it becomes important for the executive team to really formulate what is your approach to, what is your vision for artificial intelligence going forward in your organization. Now, why is that? Well, your customers will encounter technology that you deploy that uses artificial intelligence, but may have reservations, may in fact more rapidly be governed by specific legislation, or may just want to know so that when they engage with you, they kind of know what kind of organization am I working with. Your suppliers will increasingly need to know how and what your products contain, even if you have a services-oriented structure, what it contains in terms of machine learning models, because if you are part of their value chain, then of course they need to certify their end products from a perspective of the legislation as we move forward. So suppliers in any value chain that exists will clearly need to know about the partners that they have and therefore the level of AI risk the products and the services that you purchase from them actually pose. And last, but certainly not least, employees increasingly need to understand what does the organization stand for in terms of usage of artificial intelligence. And we have seen this emerge here over the course of the last 18 months as more and more people have worked from home. It's become clear that there may be technologies that are running in the background that may in fact in some instances monitor us, or that we in fact have deployed technologies that in some way contain artificial intelligence, and that may for some employees pose a degree of uncertainty about their role, their job in your organization and how things are changing. So employees need to know about this. The EU proposal supports a proactive communication to different stakeholders. Your responsibility, and perhaps it's not your personal responsibility, but it is most certainly your organization's responsibility, is right now to start to work on 3 separate charters. One for your customers that talk about what is your view, usage, and approach from an ethical perspective around artificial intelligence, some of which you may communicate publicly, for example, on your website. Secondly, you need a charter for your suppliers. And in fact, you need to embed this inside the purchasing and engagement activity with your suppliers, because increasingly, I will want to know if I am an auto manufacturer or an airplane maker, what level of risk does products that I buy contain to my overall architecture of the product that I'm now designing, given that the majority of products now, and certainly all products in the future, will have a digital twin kind of instance. So suppliers become critical from a particularly important charter perspective. And then last but not least, we have employees. For our employees, it becomes important really to see what does the organization stand for. It is really about articulating the vision, the aspiration of what we want to be. Because employees over the next 5 years will encounter digital employees that they work with. And the question is, what is your approach to that? And certainly the EU proposal drives a certain aspect of this going forward. So in summary, whatever your role is, this is in fact the first time that an emerging technology so rapidly has become an issue that is an issue for all executive environments. And therefore, within the IT organization, if you are working with these technologies, you should expect a different approach within your organization, because very rapidly the executive team have to become engaged. Now, the executive team may say, this is too early, we are going to wait, which frankly, many executive teams did with regards to GDPR. However, I would argue, one, this is a different kind of deployment. Two, for anyone that has gone through technology challenges the last couple of years, we all know a little preparation sets us free. And being prepared for this now, making this part of the executive team's discussion is actually critical. It will make things much easier for you as we move into the next couple of years, in which certainly vast majorities of this proposal will become embedded into national legislation across Europe. And therefore, whether you're a European headquartered organization or you are operating in Europe, this becomes the executive team's issue. Thank you.